I'm Spencer Mazyck, and joining me now is lawyer turned appetizing shop owner Mark Russ Federman. He's the grandson of Joel Russ, the founder of Russ Daughters on the Lower East Side. Mark ran the family business for over 30 years before turning it over to a fourth generation in 2009. He is also the author of Russ Daughters, Reflections and Recipes from the House That Herring Built. Welcome, Mark. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
So, Mark, for folks out there who may not know, can you tell us what is an appetizing store? What does the term mean?
It's actually easier to say what it's not. It is not a delicatessen. Most people call us a deli, but it's not. On the Lower East Side, in parallel universes, there's the delicatessen, which specialized in smoked, cured, and pickled meats, pastrami, salami, corned beef, and everything that went with that. And appetizing was smoked, cured, and pickled fish, so it's lox and herring and whitefish and everything that goes along with that. But what usually goes along with those fish items are dairy products, butter, cream cheese, sour cream sauce for herring. And Jewish dietary laws prescribed the mixing of meat and dairy items, so you have two separate stores selling two separate lines of product.
And your grandfather opened the store in 1914 after selling herring from a push cart, is that right?
That's correct.
So, I mean, at the time, wasn't it just one of many appetizing stores on the Lower East Side?
Sure. They were selling basically a staple, mostly herring, which was cheap, maybe 3 herring for 10 cents. And that provided a meal for a poor immigrant family. It's a cheap source of protein. And so there were many places that segued from just selling herring from push carts to moving into a store in which you were able to sell herring and then some of the fish items, lox, which was salt-cured salmon, and then whitefish and smoked salmons. And at some point there was at least 20 or 30 of those types of stores on the Lower East Side alone.
And so the name Russ Daughters actually didn't come until several years later, I think in 1935. And so tell me this, did your mom, Ann, and her sisters, Hattie and Ida, did they have a say as to whether or not they would work for the family business?
No. They were conscripted. It's not anything they did by choice, but it was a depression, and my grandfather couldn't afford to hire help, nor was there enough business around. But he couldn't run it himself easy enough. So he had his daughters. There was no issue for him of sending them to college. And in fact, my aunt wasn't even allowed to finish high school. He conscripted them into the business. They ran the business with him, and then ultimately they married, and their husbands were brought into the business.
That's pretty amazing. Then did the husbands have a say, or they just sort of that, okay, I'm marrying you now, I'm marrying into the business?
I think, at that point in the Depression, they actually probably looked forward to becoming part of an actual store rather than a push cart. And stores were hard to come by. Life was very difficult in those days. But Grandpa Russ, we call him Grandpa Russ, he didn't just allow them to marry whomever they wanted to. He had what we can call the right of first refusal. Each daughter had to bring their suitor to him, and he had to size them up as to whether they were going to look good behind the counter, whether they can add up a column of figures on a brown paper bag, whether they could slice lox. And he did, in fact, approve each one of their suitors, became their husbands, my father and my uncles, and they ultimately took over running the business.
What do you remember most about Grandpa Russ, as you call him? Was he particularly gruff?
Yeah, he was a typical Eastern European immigrant, short on patience and long on drive, which is not necessarily good in the retail world. So if a customer would come in, a tough customer, and give him a hard time, and the Lower East Side, I think, is the origin of all the tough customers in the world, I think, were born on the Lower East Side. And I understand that times were difficult, and if they had a few cents, they were going to make sure they got what they wanted. But if they said to Grandpa Russ, I don't want that, I don't want this, go in the back and get me a fresh one, he would say to them in Yiddish, but the translation was, lady, do me a favor, lose my address. Fortunately for him, that's not a good business model for retail. Fortunately, he had 3 pretty young daughters who were able to charm and disarm even the most difficult of customers. And that sort of made his business. It freed him up to go to the smokehouses and pick out the best fish. So Russ and Daughters became known not only for the three pretty girls fishing herrings out of barrels, but because they had the best fish in town. So he concentrated on that and let his daughters be the retail face of the business.
And did you grow up helping out at the store after school, over the weekends, or even during the summers?
Yes, that was required. And my generation, the third generation, at some point, usually around the age of 13, we were required to come in the store, and there were 7 of us on a rotating basis, one day, each day of the weekend, and work behind the candy counter. The store had a fish counter, and on the other side a candy counter, which sold dried fruit and chocolates and nuts and halva. We were never allowed behind the fish counter because there was a lot of activity and sharp knives. But the concept was for us to learn what it meant to make a buck. So all of us had to do that. Similarly, we weren't particularly willing participants in it, but I think we got the best education possible just by seeing what was going on in that store and how difficult it was for our parents and why they came home cranky and a little fishy. But it was a good lesson.
Well, so tell me this, Mark, why did you go to law school? Was that an effort to escape the family business?
Actually, that was, no. The irony here is that my parents and aunts and uncles and grandparents worked so hard and in such difficult conditions. There was nothing in those days celebrated about food. It's not like now there are, hot chefs and Food Network and food books and gourmet supermarkets. It was just downright hard work. And they worked 6 days a week, 10, 12 hours a day, in order that the next generation, my generation, would not have to do this. They didn't want us in the business. They wanted us not to come in the business. And their hope was that we would get college educations, because none of them had it, and be able to work in an office and work 5 days a week and not 6 days a week and not on the weekends, and put on a suit and tie and come home and not smell so fishy. That was their hope. Their ultimate fantasy was perhaps one of us, or many of us, or some of us, on the third generation level, might become a professional, a doctor, a lawyer, an accountant, a dentist. That was their ultimate fantasy. And of the 7 Russ grandchildren, I was the one who was probably the most bookish and nerdy, and I went on and got the professional degree, the law degree, and I went on and practiced law for 8 or 9 years, which gave them bragging rights in the store, particularly my father. If you came in and ordered a piece of fish, he'd somehow wind the conversation around and let me tell you about my son, the lawyer. Right. So what's ironic is that I am the only one of the 7 grandchildren of Joel Russ, the one who is living out their fantasy, who says, I want to come in and take over the business.
Well, so why did you do that? I mean, did you enjoy practicing law?
I did for a while. I was a litigator. I had been a litigator in the military because I went, after law school was 1969, I was right in the military, and then I was attached to the Judge Advocate General's Corps, and I was stationed in San Francisco, I was stationed in Vietnam. Mostly I was trying cases. And I came back and I worked for a prosecutor's office and then with a private firm. So basically I was on trial all the time. And while that's fun for a while, for me, at any rate, it wore thin. And it's like playing chess, and how many days in a row do you want to play chess? And when you're going home at night, you're bringing the work in the court in your head. You're bringing, and how can you? It's an adversarial system we have in the law, and basically your job is to best your opponent. And so that didn't, after a number of years of doing it, it sort of wore thin for me, and I was looking for something that had more meaning to me. And Russ Daughters provides that by way of my own family history and also by virtue of the product and the service it provides to the world. It's very much a win-win situation as opposed to adversarial.
But it sounds like you grew tired, a little bit tired of practicing day in and day out. But initially when you started helping out at Russ Daughters, you actually thought that you could do both, help out and then still also do the law thing.
Right, that was my fantasy, and I don't know what I was smoking. It wasn't fish. I thought I would leave this fancy law firm I was with, and I would practice law part-time and help my family run the business part-time. But the first day I came into the store was the last day I practiced law. I mean, that shop and those products and those customers and the employees are probably the most finicky in the world. And there's nothing easy about that business. Of course, I didn't realize that because I'd always worked behind the candy counter. But I didn't realize the product is very expensive to us. It's smoked salmon and sturgeon and caviar, and you've got to be careful about that. And it all requires a focus and, in fact, an obsession about making sure your product is handled right and it's the best product coming in and going out. So the concept of practicing law part-time the first day went out the window.
And so that was back in 1978. And like I mentioned in the intro, more than 30 years later, you've now turned it over to the next generation. So who's running the store these days?
It's my daughter, Nikki, and my nephew, Josh. They have the same degree of relationship to Joel Russ as their great-grandfather. They went out in the world and did various things, and somehow it occurred to them also that maybe Russ and Daughters makes sense for us. It's a place worthy of continuing, and they're doing it probably, I guess I'm doing this in front of a lot of people, your audience, but they're probably doing it better than I ever did. The customers are happy, and the suppliers are happy, and I go in basically for one reason, is to eat my way down the counter, both because I love the products, and two is to make sure that the most important thing is being well handled, and that is the quality of the product, the fish. And so I'm very happy walking in there, eating, and realizing this is as good as it's ever been.
And so I know you also have a son who's in medicine. Were you at least a little bit disappointed when he came to you and said, "Dad, I want to be a doctor"?
I claim to be the only Jewish father who's upset his kid wanted to be a doctor. I'm talking about sturgeon, and he's thinking surgeon. But, he's a successful doctor, and he does pediatric oncology. So he's doing God's work, and he's doing it very well. So I cut him a little slack.
So next year marks 100 years of doing business for Russ & Daughters. Why do you think the company has been so successful for such a long time?
Because I think it's about family who's attached to the product and the location and the history and the traditions. And in each generation we try to make it a little better, but we also keep one foot with what we've had. We understand that there's something that goes on in that store that's not just the commercial transaction of money and product transferring across a counter. The place actually has a soul of its own. And so, it's not like every generation, everybody wants to come in the business. It's one or two that say, yeah, that's meaningful to me and I want to keep it going. And so then your name is on the door, it says Russ on the neon outside the door, it says Russ on the packaging, on the containers, and the wrapping. And so if your name is on it, you're going to angst about every piece of product that goes out the door, and you want it to be perfect. I think that's part of why we continue.
It was a high level of quality there. And I will say that the book, is that also a collection of stories from over the years and a memoir of sorts for you?
Right. The book is, by and large, what I've collected or absorbed from years of standing behind the counter and listening to the stories from the generations before me. Of course, while I was behind the counter, I had no opportunity to really pay attention or write down the stories. And then you get home and you're tired. So it required me to retire and then reflect. If you're running a small business, you're reacting all the time. Something happens, somebody comes in, they want this, they don't want that, somebody calls, you don't have it. So you're constantly reacting when you're running a small business, and it takes retirement to then think about, well, what happened here, and what is it that I've been doing for the last 30 years that's the same or different than the way my parents and aunts and uncles or grandparents did it. And the book was my way of addressing that, thinking about the things that I was living but couldn't think about before. And
I know that your mom and Aunt Hattie, they've had an opportunity to read the book. What did they think of it?
I was deathly afraid. I happened to be in Florida when the first books, before they were even released to the public, came into Random House, and then the publisher was kind enough to send a copy down to my mother and to my aunt. So they got the first ones off the press, and I happened to be there, and I was afraid of what I was going to hear. I anticipated them saying, "What'd you have to tell them that for? They don't need to know that. That was a family secret. You let everybody know." But much to my surprise was that they were thrilled. They were thrilled to read it. because I think it validated the lives that they lived that was so hard, and that's all it was for them, hard work. And now they see that they're, in a sense, these two elderly ladies. My aunt was just 100 years old, my mother's 92. Suddenly they're rock stars in their little development in Florida.
Well, I know that your grandfather is looking down, and he's very proud of what you've done with what he started so many years ago. Thanks very much for joining us today,
Thank you
Mark.
very much.
For more information on this or other topics, subscribe to BloombergLaw.com. You can follow us on Facebook and Twitter. Thank you for joining us. Bye, everybody.